History 1. Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. This story first started unfolding 15 years ago and spanned the next 13 years of my life. It all began in the summertime, about 4 months after we moved to a new house in a different state. I was 9 years old at the time and didn't have any friends in the area yet. One day I was out in the front yard helping my dad with yard work. He would mow the front and back yards, and I would either pull dandelions out of the ground or water the plants in front of the house. It's not much, I know, but I was 9 and wasn't allowed to do anything with the lawnmower except maybe pull the cord to start the motor. My dad had just finished the front yard and had moved to the backyard while I stayed in the front to finish up. I remember seeing a package on the porch in front of our house and going up to pick it up. That was when I turned around and saw him. A man in his late 30s with long dark hair tied in a ponytail hanging down past his shoulders, wearing a plain white t-shirt, black pajama pants and no socks or shoes, was standing at the end of our street. He stood with his arms crossed, staring directly at me. For context, my house was 4 houses down from the end of the street. At the end of my street, there was a road forming a T-shaped intersection. On the other side of this intersection from my house, there were 3 houses, one lined up with the middle of my street, and the other 2 sitting to the right of it. To the left of the house lined up with my street was an old steel treating factory, surrounded by houses in our neighborhood, and at that time it was still active 24/7. This man was standing in front of the house lined up with my street, right off the edge of the street and in front of what I assumed was his house, just staring at me. As soon as I saw him, I immediately froze and stared back at him, a sudden uneasy feeling washing over me. The longer I looked at him, the more red flags I noticed. To my 9-year-old mind, this man was dressed very strangely, which was an immediate red flag. But the creepiest thing that stood out was his face. His face had absolutely no expression of any kind, just an intense and piercing stare, as if he was looking right through me. For at least 2 minutes we stared at each other, never looking away or even blinking. Eventually, the uneasy feeling built up enough for me to slowly walk myself down off the porch and over to the side of our house, never breaking eye contact from the man. When I made it out of sight, I ran to the backyard to tell my dad what had just happened. I came up to him as he finished mowing the backyard and described what I'd seen. That was when he told me he had seen this man the other day doing the same thing, just standing and staring down our street, arms crossed, plain white t-shirt, pajama pants, no shoes, just like when I'd seen him. After that, my dad told me he thought the man seemed off and to stay far, far away from him. Unfortunately, that would not be the last time I saw the man at the end of our street. From that point on, I would see this man much more often. Whether I was riding in the car with my family, outside doing something in our yard or on our block, I would look over and see him standing in the same spot, arms crossed, intensely staring. He wasn't there 24/7, but at least 3 days a week I would see him outside, sometimes for 5 or more hours at a time, if not staring at me, then staring at someone walking their dog or a car passing by. Once I tried to figure out his schedule so I wouldn't have to be around him as much, but it felt too creepy keeping track of him because he would occasionally start scanning his head around, looking for people to lock onto, which really creeped me out. Now some of you may be thinking, he's just staring and not doing anything, that's not that bad. Correct. Well, sadly I would later find out that things were far worse than I had ever imagined. So fast forward about 9 years. I'm now 18 years old and looking to get a job to save up for my first car. I hadn't really been able to save any money until that point, and my parents weren't in any position to help me with purchasing one. So I knew I had to find a job that would be easy for me to get, and that would pay me enough to hopefully get a cheap car quickly. Lo and behold, the steel treating factory next to the creepy man's house had a now hiring sign out front, and I decided a 2-minute walk to work had to be worth it, even if it meant walking by the creepy man's house. I had seen this guy doing this routine for almost a decade at this point, and figured it wasn't going to be a problem. So I applied and ended up getting the job. It was hard work, which usually consisted of heavy physical labor and keeping up a constant pace, but nothing I hadn't expected. I started off fairly slowly but ended up getting much better and able to do tasks much faster. About 3 months in, I was assigned to work on a machine I hadn't previously worked on, located in the loading dock. From the loading dock, I had a clear view of the wooden fence that separated the factory loading zone from the creepy man's house, as well as the front of his driveway where he would normally stand. I couldn't see the man standing at his post, but I noticed a large hole in the fence, which seemed like it had been made in some kind of accident. The fence wasn't broken cleanly. There were splinters and cracks where the hole had been made. I asked the floor worker who was with me at the dock, Ronnie, if he knew anything about this. This actually got us into a longer conversation about the creepy man. Ronnie had been with the steel treating factory for over 15 years and had seen the man during his staring routine more than once. According to Ronnie, the hole in the fence had been made by the creepy man, who told the managers of the plant that it had been an accident with his truck. But that's not all. Ronnie then told me the creepy neighbor guy actually ran a daycare out of his house, which was an unregistered business, and it had led to police being called on him more than once. This surprised me, as I'd never seen the police over at his house before. After Ronnie told me this, something else occurred to me when looking at the creepy man's house. Whenever his van wasn't in the driveway, you could see one of those children's mini playgrounds with a slide and toys built into it, the kind toddlers would play with. This always struck me as odd because never once in those 9 years had I ever seen anybody else come or go from his house, especially not any children. But I'd never really dedicated much thought to it. After Ronnie told me this, I thought back to when I'd first seen him as a 9-year-old, and all the other times he'd stared at me growing up. I began to wonder if he'd been secretly plotting to try to get me over to his unofficial daycare. Sadly, I couldn't really confirm what Ronnie had told me. At this point, I'd been dealing with my own personal problems at home, so I just filed the story into the back of my head as something I wouldn't be surprised to find out was true. I left that job not long after this. I'd saved up the money I needed for a car and was able to make my way into the career field I'd been hoping to make it into. Fast forward 3 years later to one of the scariest things that has ever happened to me, and the reason for my posting this. At this point, I'd moved away from home, but ended up having to move back with my parents for reasons I'm not going to get into. I'd also met my girlfriend, and we would spend some nights driving over to my parents' house to watch old movies or play games with my janky basement setup. By this point, my girlfriend was aware of the creepy man but paid him as much mind as anybody else. As creepy as he wasn't breaking the law by standing there, and our lives already had too much going on for us to focus our time and attention on his weirdness. On this night, I was driving home with my girlfriend for a normal night of watching movies. I didn't want to block my mother's car in our single-lane driveway, so I had recently started parking in the grass patch behind our house. Behind our house was an alley that ran past everybody's backyards. Our backyard had a wooden fence up against the alley with a separate garage building that opened into the alley. I'd started parking in the grass patch area between the garage doors and the alley more often, so that was the direction I'd been driving home, silently hoping the creepy man wouldn't be outside on a pleasant night like this. Well, of course I jinxed it, and the way home I was going took us right past him, standing and staring us down. I locked eyes with him very briefly as we drove past him, heading to the right side of the T intersection to turn into the alley to go behind my house. But here's where things got scary. For some reason, I don't know why, as we passed by the creepy man, I got a really bad feeling. A feeling very similar to the day I'd first seen him. A gut-wrenching something is wrong kind of feeling. So I decided to look in my driver's side mirror. History 2. This is a true story. God is my witness. I am not making it up. I am 57 years old now, and this is a memory that never goes away, never fades. In 1986, I stopped in Topa, Kansas, on my way back from working in Yellowstone National Park for the summer. My friend Mark had also just graduated from high school a few years before and had moved to Topeka with his parents. I stayed about a week. His parents invited me to stay an extra day for their family reunion before I headed back home. We drove way out into the country for their family reunion in his old beater car and spent all day with his extended family. In the late afternoon, we made our way back to Topeka in his old beater car with the broken gas gauge. We ran out of gas. Mark said we were probably 6 to 7 miles from the nearest gas station. This was pre-cell phone era. We were trying to figure out what to do when suddenly a van with no windows pulled over and asked us if we needed help. When you're young, you think these things just miraculously happen for you. When you're older, you know better. We told him we ran out of gas. A friendly enough man offered to take us to the nearest gas station. We got in the van to discover there were a total of 3 men in the vehicle. There were no seats in the back. We were just sitting on the floor of what appeared to be a work-type, beat-up older model white van. Then we clearly heard the men discussing doing us harm. The driver said he knew a good place to go. The other man in the passenger seat, eyeing me, agreed. He nodded his approval. Only one man, sitting nearest us, said he was not in and did not want to be involved in this at all. That he had a baby now and wasn't cool with this, that he didn't want any part of it. The driver and the passenger seat rider muttered something under their breaths that I couldn't hear. There was an angry silence while the driver thought this over. In my mind, I prayed one word: help. My mind felt like it was stuttering thoughts. Part of me was in denial, another part in shock. Fear hadn't even set in yet. It was just like a jolt to the system of an unreal horror happening to somebody else. Because an hour ago I was completely safe, without a care in the world. Now the absurd idea of someone assaulting me, yes, I was acutely aware, assaulting me and murdering both of us was what they would do, and leaving us somewhere nobody would find us. Those things were flipping through my mind. Have you ever been to Kansas? There are lots of lonely, God-forsaken, desolate roads to nowhere. If at any point the third guy changed his mind or simply said, "Just let him out first," I wouldn't be sharing this with you right now. They stopped talking to each other. They had never spoken to us at all from the moment we entered the van. My friend and I didn't speak to each other. We barely looked at each other. We were afraid. I could hear the clanging rattletrap van's noises and the tires on the road. I saw my friend flexing as if to warn he would fight to defend himself while they were discussing where they would take us. Everything felt surreal. But the guy in the back, the guy that said no. And just like that, the driver pulled over. The guy in the back opened the side door and let us out. And it was over. The air smelt somehow fragile and tainted. The ground looked different, like I couldn't quite trust it. My friend looked as shaken as I felt. We had survived a close encounter with shark-like predators, the blackest, darkest evil. I looked at the gas station in the late afternoon, waning sunset just before dark. That gas station had transformed itself into a beacon of shining light, a safe haven of shelter and safety. I knew once we got into that gas station there was no way I would walk back to the car. The white van with no windows pulling away from us felt surreal, like looking at it might give it the power to suck us up in its vacuum of ill intent. Today I can still see that van pulling away, a sort of mirage from a nightmare that had crossed over into my waking reality. History 3. This is a story about my dad's ex-girlfriend. My dad has terrible luck with women. He's like a magnet for craziness. Every woman he's ever dated, except his current girlfriend, has been abusive, both mentally and physically. This list includes my mother. But this is a story about his last girlfriend, Emily. She's gone from not only stalking him but also stalking me, my husband, and our son too. They met at a Christmas party and hit it off. He'd just gotten out of another bad relationship with a different woman that he'd been on and off with for 3 years. She was the classic narcissist type. Well, Emily seemed different. She claimed she was also just out of an abusive relationship. They went out for a few months, but she never let my dad over to her place. He didn't find it all that weird until he received a call from a man who said Emily was his wife and wanted to know how my dad knew her. At first, my dad thought the guy was her ex still trying to control her. But things started to add up. He finally confronted Emily, and she gave him some story about how her ex was refusing to sign the papers. But they were separated. My dad did a bit of digging and even talked to Emily's parents at one point. He found out that not only was Emily definitely still married, but she wasn't even separated from her husband. As far as everyone in her life knew, she was happily married. And my dad was just a friend, if they knew about him at all. Needless to say, he broke up with her. Emily lost it. She started showing up at his work, calling in the middle of the night, texting him 50+ times a day, all that good stuff. My dad moved states twice and changed his number several times to try to get away from her, but she always managed to find him. Love letters would arrive in the mail, or she would call and say she was coming to see him. Then she found my phone number. It was probably sometime after my dad moved in with me. She started texting me almost as much as him. Once I married my husband and had my son, she really went all out, sending me presents for her new grandson, always wanting updates and the like. I never replied, and either sent back unopened packages or donated the items she'd sent directly to me from shops. Everything finally came to a head when she arrived on my dad's doorstep while he was at work with a casserole for him. She gave it to his roommate and told him it was because she noticed my dad was losing weight. He told his roommate to toss it. He didn't want to risk poison since he just applied for a restraining order. That same night, she showed up at my apartment while my husband worked the overnight shift. It was after 1 a.m. when she started knocking on my door. I was glad that I'd sent my toddler to my aunt and uncle's house for the night when I saw it was her. She left banana bread on my doorstep that we threw out as soon as my husband got home. The next night, I again left my toddler with my aunt and uncle in case she came back. She did. I started getting texts from her as she pounded on my door. She wanted to see her grandbaby and have some girl time with me. It slowly devolved into demands for me to open up the door. I called the cops. While I was on the phone with dispatch, my neighbor came out ready to take her on. He told her the cops were on their way since his wife already called them. She disappeared pretty quickly into the park across the street. The cops didn't catch her, but my dad's restraining order did get granted. We have since moved across the state, but she still texts me from time to time, wanting to know how my dad is or what my son is up to. I never answer, but I do save all of her texts just in case I have to get my own restraining order as well. History 4. My ex and I broke up about a year ago, and it got very messy. I was receiving DMs, texts, and Snapchats from what seemed like everyone from her hometown. I got everything from name-calling to death threats. I ended up having to block about 10 people from 3 different sources of social media. But that's beside the point. The worst threats I received were from her recent ex, Steve. One read, "You hurt my girl, it's over for you. I know what town you live in, I will find you, and when I do, even your parents won't be able to recognize your body." He also sent me several others explaining the ways he would torture me. I just ended up blocking him along with everyone else and moved on with my life. Well, today, getting closer to our 1-year mark of breaking up, my ex, Laura, and I have started to talk again and are on okay terms. Everything seemed fine. I went about my day and walked over to this popular deli to grab a bite to eat. I ended up passing a friend of mine along the way. They shouted my name across the street and headed over. We talked for a bit and then split ways as I headed over to the deli. This is when I was approached by 3 taller guys. My stomach hit the ground when I saw the guy's face. It was Steve, Laura's ex-boyfriend. I knew instantly from having to stare at his profile picture, and he had brought friends and found me. Steve quickly grabbed my shoulder tightly and looked me in the eyes. I stared back and he seemed full of rage and insanity. "I finally found you," he said in probably the calmest voice. He continued to whisper, "You know what I have to do now. I'm a man of my word." Every inch of my body began to crawl. Fight or flight was kicking in, and at the time it felt like slow motion. My brain was running 1,000,000 miles per hour. 3v1, okay, this isn't good, but they can't just kill me here in broad daylight. They do have the car. Oh God, they're going to kidnap me first. I started to look for an exit. Steve then tightened his grip and said, "Nobody's going to save you." That's when I booked it, full pedal to the metal. I knocked his grip off of me and watched as the 3 guys tried to grab me, but I was already gone. I ran as fast as I could. Thankfully, I know the area pretty well, so I took off towards the direction of my friend's apartment. They chased after me, screaming full-blown battle cries. I turned the corner, and by the luck of 1,000,000 gods, somebody was exiting my friend's apartment building, which had a locked outside gate. I dashed in and slammed the gate behind me. I watched for about 5 minutes as they searched the area nearby for me, checking in and behind dumpsters. These guys were serious. I feel lucky to even be telling this event right now. This is one crazy I hope I never meet again. History 5. During college, I dated a fairly well-known and talented local musician named Jake. As horrible boyfriends tend to be in the beginning, he was a loving, attentive, charismatic, seemingly normal partner. He made me mixtapes, cooked me my favorite meals, and dedicated songs to me at open mics around town. I, young, foolish, and naive, was deeply smitten by his mysterious, dark, artistic allure. However, over the course of our year-long relationship, his mental health severely declined. He had the ability to appear lucid and normal around other people, but in private he began suffering delusions, compulsively lying, and creating art that focused on themes of assault and murder. I was worried sick, and his condition was exhausting, but I did my best to be kind, understanding, and supportive. I loved him and believed that he shouldn't have to struggle with his mental illness alone. One time he vanished without a trace for a full day. I found his apartment empty, lights on, front door wide open, phone on his nightstand. I took a few deep breaths and called all around the city for hours before finally discovering he'd been involuntarily checked into a mental hospital. I did my best to be strong for him, seeing him every day during supervised visitation hour, bringing him his favorite books to pass the time, and holding him as he sobbed that it was all a mistake, that he did not belong there. It was surreal to see my gentle, intelligent, albeit depressed boyfriend surrounded by visibly insane long-term psychiatric patients. For real, the place was like something out of a horror movie. In retrospect, none of the staff ever told me the real reason why he was there, and I was too polite and naive to ask. Our relationship ended a few months later when I found undeniable evidence that he was cheating on me. Secretly relieved, I confronted him. I told him to leave my apartment and never come back. He cracked. The gentle Jake I'd known and loved melted away to reveal a new persona with dead, wild animal eyes. He threatened to end it all with pills unless I took him back, but I was so extremely done that I called the police. They weren't much help, but Jake did leave. I blocked him everywhere and never contacted him again, but he left me insane voicemails from different numbers for weeks afterward. I was relatively unshaken, and things returned to normal. I graduated and got a sweet job in the same cool college city. 6 months later, I woke up to concerned texts from my mutual friends saying they didn't want to freak me out, but Jake was off his meds, clearly manic, and was posting a newly written song all over social media. His best friend, who hadn't been in touch since before the breakup, sent me an apology along with a screenshot of the lyrics that got my attention. I won't tell you what they were because they'll lead back to his Bandcamp, but the song was pretty explicit about my assault and murder, but in a sort of cleverly disguised way. It's catchy too, the bastard. I checked his profiles myself from a friend's account, and he was posting dozens and dozens of totally insane, rambling statuses, most of them about me. They flip-flopped between flowery love prose and murder imagery. His friends were reacting with concern, but a few egged him on, probably thinking he was just venting about his ex. I decided it was best to continue ignoring him, but I saved screenshots just in case. A few days later, while at work, I looked up from my computer to see Jake enter the far side of the studio. My blood turned to ice. He was talking to my creative director. It looked cordial enough, and I saw Jake begin to casually scan the studio. I ducked down and bolted into my favorite project manager's office, slammed the door, and unleashed upon her what must have been a nearly unintelligible explanation of what was happening. I was shaking so hard I could barely speak, but Nancy was amazing. She understood almost immediately. She snuck me out of the building and drove me in her car to the police station, where I showed officers the screenshots and filed a report. My co-workers later told me that Jake was there to inquire about the open designer position. He is not a designer. He brought with him a portfolio and an elaborately fabricated work history that sounded legit. At the end of his interview, he casually asked if I still worked there. He said we used to collaborate. Oh, and he'd written a song for me, and it had been picked up by local radio this morning. He asked my co-workers to let me know, with warmest regards. That phrase still makes my skin crawl. He then left, found my abandoned car in the parking lot, and paced behind it until the police arrived. Unfortunately, he wasn't enough of a public menace for the police to bring him in that day, but the incident helped me to secure a restraining order against him. My company was amazing too. I was deeply embarrassed about my literally insane ex coming to the studio, but the CEO filed trespassing charges against him and created an action plan to keep me safe if it ever happened again. Not long afterward, I moved to a different city, and that was that. I haven't heard from him since, but I discovered the most alarming part later. His roommate at the time, Sarah, went through a similar experience with him during his breakdown, and when we compared notes much later, she said she'd seen a large axe in Jake's car the same week it had all gone down. She said that she was worried about Jake's Facebook activity, so she removed the axe and hid it. Jake was so angry that he completely trashed their house and never came back. And if our timelines are correct, that must have been just before he came into my workplace for his interview. History 6. This ain't so much about one encounter, but more of a terrifying experience I've never told to anyone besides the police. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about it and only now realized how much the whole thing really messed me up. So here goes. I met this fella named Mike at a bar one night. We had a great time, partied all night, and eventually ended up back at my apartment. After that night, he basically lived with me instead of the hostel he was staying at. We clicked right away, and I enjoyed having him around. We dated for about 3 months before the first night he attacked me. It was the night of my 30th birthday. We celebrated, had a blast, and passed out around 3 a.m. He had told me he suffered from PTSD and night terrors. Many nights he'd woken up freaking out. I was deeply passed out when I woke to 5 quick blows to the head and face. I tried to cover myself, not knowing what was happening. When I realized my arms were pinned at my sides, Mike was sitting on my chest with his legs on my arms, strangling me. Before I had any idea where I even was, I remember the light fading and going black as he squeezed harder on my neck. When he let go, the blood eventually rushed back to my brain, and I remember seeing him walk to the bathroom. At that point, I grabbed the dogs and ran to my car and took off. He must have passed back out. He called me hours later, completely confused as to where I'd gone. I told him everything he'd done, and he promised me he didn't mean to do any of that. He said he would never do that on purpose and promised to seek help. I agreed to come back on the terms that if he ever scared me again, he'd be gone. Exactly 1 week later, in my sleep, I woke up to him on top of me, but he wasn't doing anything. I slowly pushed him off and pretended to be getting ready for work. Out of nowhere, he jumped up and sucker punched me in the mouth. I fell onto the bed, and he again tried to strangle me. This time, I didn't fight and pretended to pass out. He let me go once he thought I was passed out and went to the kitchen. As soon as he left, I grabbed my dogs again and booked it to the car. I jumped in the car and locked it. This time, he chased me. That was when I realized this was not some PTSD nightmare sleepwalking freak out. He was a psychopath. He was awake and very coherent. He was screaming that he'd burn my house down if I didn't come out, trying to break the windows to get into my car. As soon as I got the doors locked, I called the cops. He went back inside. When the cops arrived, I told them he's crazy and might try to attack them. When they went in, he was quietly waiting for them and went without any resistance. He knew what he did. It wasn't until during the trial that I found out there was a knife in my bed. When he let go of me and went to the kitchen thinking I was passed out, he went to get a butcher's knife and left it on the bed when he chased me out. No one can prove what he was planning, but I'm convinced he was going to stab me to death. He wasn't charged with anything in the end because the DA pulled some fancy lawyering maneuvers and tricked him into walking right into the arms of ICE as soon as he left the courthouse. I have to say, that was satisfying to watch. He was deported and banned from the country. He still tries to contact me on social media by making new accounts to try to get me to help with his appeal to be allowed back. He still claims he wasn't awake for any of this. I don't know what to believe, but I know I feel a lot safer with him on the other side of the globe. I've been having a hard time sleeping since then. I kind of brushed everything off and carried on with my life as if none of this ever happened. Thinking about it recently, I realized being attacked in your sleep and coming that close to possibly being a murder victim might cause some lasting psychological damage. I'm considering seeking help. maybe sharing the story for once might be a healthy first step. History 7. Back around 2004 or 2005, I was leaving my buddy Dave's house and headed home. He lived near Lake Aspen in Wayne County, and I was a good 15 miles away. I decided to take the back roads to save time and avoid any run-ins with the cops. As I crested this mountain road, I saw a van off to the side with its doors open and lights on. It was well past midnight, and there wasn't a soul on the road. I slowed my 1989 VW ragtop down to first gear, looking for anyone who might be hurt. Not a single person was around, and the woods were eerily quiet. The van wasn't running, but all the lights were on and the driver's door was open. I remember thinking I didn't have cell phone service until I got to the top of the mountain, where I could call the cops. So I proceeded towards where I knew I could get a signal, maybe going 30 miles per hour tops. The situation was already giving me the creeps, but then it got even worse. No more than 3 or so miles away, the brush thinned on the roadside, giving me a better view of the woods. I saw a movement, so I let off the gas, thinking I didn't want to hit a deer. As I let off, a man soaked in fresh blood came from the tree line and into the road. He was so covered in gore I couldn't tell it was a man at first. He stumbled out in front of my car and waved me down. I had the top down on my ragtop, of course. He was yelling and grabbing at my door. I dropped into first gear and took off. After another mile or so, I finally had cell service and called the cops. The guy was obviously hurt, and his grab at my door scared me. There was a wide space on the mountain where I agreed to wait for the cops. They arrived in under 10 minutes. While I waited, I put the top up and locked the doors. An officer took my statement and looked over my car with a flashlight. The guy from the woods had left a bloody smear down my door. Another officer found the van but couldn't locate the man who came out of the woods. The cops let me go home and said they'd call if they needed anything further. Within a few days, I got a call saying the van was located, and they asked if I could describe the man. They never found him that night, and as far as I know, they never did. Apparently, the van was stolen, and the cops surmised the guy banged himself up and took off in a panic. To this day, I keep a lookout for a bloody man running out of the woods. This experience has stuck with me and is 100% true.